You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
JT Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mom,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is... Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm super excited to have Jeffrey Archer on the show with me. He has a fantastic new book in his William Warwick series. It's book 5, I believe it is. It's called Next in Line, and what a fortuitous time for this book to come out. I read it a few weeks ago, but then with the events going on in Great Britain right now, it struck me as oddly timely. We'll just put it that way. I love the book, and I know that you are too. I love the whole William Warwick series and what you're doing with it. Welcome to the show, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Hank. And it's interesting you say that, because I conceived the idea of the book 2 years ago, wrote it a year ago, and as you rightly say, you read it several weeks ago.
Right.
I had already decided at that time that William Warwick, in his progression from constable to commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, in book 5 would be a chief superintendent and would be in charge of royalty protection. In other words, protecting Her Majesty the Queen, with his number 2, Ross Hogan, Inspector Hogan, taking care of the protection of Princess Diana. So I couldn't have known that the monarch would die. In fact, if I were to be honest with you, Hank, I thought and hoped she'd live to 100.
I think everyone had that same hope, that and it seemed that she would. It really came as a shock to everyone, I think.
Her mother did. Well, the shock came that only 2 days before her death, she signed in a new prime minister.
Exactly, and we all watched it. It was...
Exactly, and I looked at her. I thought she looked a little fragile, but she appeared to carry out her duties as monarch, accepting a new prime minister with her usual skill, diligence, and wisdom. And so when 2 days later she was no longer with us, that was a tremendous shock.
It was. We've gotten a little bit ahead of ourselves in the conversation, but I want to dial back for just a minute, and we'll come back to William Warwick. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is: what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, I'd been a member of Parliament, Hank, at far too young an age, at the age of 29. Assuming I was going to have a long career in politics, because I was in what we call in this country a safe seat. I had a 10,000 majority. But I very foolishly invested in a company on the advice of the Bank of Boston, and lost a fortune. And the stupidity was putting even more money into it that I didn't have, which I borrowed. And when I was facing bankruptcy, thank heavens I never went bankrupt, I conceived the idea on leaving Parliament of writing Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less, the story of 4 men who lose a fortune and decide to steal it back from the person who stole it from them. But they mustn't go over the top, because that would be stealing. They have to take back only what he took. And so I would say I was very unusual in that way, Hank. I came to writing by mistake. And indeed, my first book was turned down by 17 publishers.
Wow.
And only sold, the 18th publisher only managed 3,000 copies. Indeed, at the end of my first year of publication, my wife Mary said, "I think it's time for you to find a real job." But I battled on. And as you know, Cain and Abel had this amazing breakthrough of selling a million books in the first week and has now been read by 100 million people. So my life changed overnight with my third book, Cain and Abel.
It's so interesting because Cain and Abel is one of those books that, like you said, is life-changing. There's after a book like that has the success that it has, there's no turning back. You've crossed a Rubicon of sorts. When you were writing that novel, was there anything different about the creative process of that book that would have given you any inclination that this was going to be the one that went supernova?
Absolutely none. I handed it in. My agent said, we're not going to sell this book. We're going to auction it. So I said, what does that mean? My agent was a wonderful lady called Debbie Owen. She said, I'm going to show it to the 11 big houses in the United States. I'm going to give them one book. And after they've read it, I'm going to hold an auction. And I said, well, what happens if nobody bids? He said, well, it won't get published. And the auction began on a Monday morning and finished on a Friday night, just after midnight, and sold for $3,200,000. So I suppose I should have then, Hank, thought, hello, something strange is happening here. But, even then, I didn't have the confidence to believe clearly what the publishers believe. So, excuse me for a moment.
Sure.
So another 9 months went by before it was published. I was luckily with Simon & Schuster, a very distinguished American house.
Sure.
And I was edited by the great Corley Smith, who'd edited J.D. Salinger. So I knew I was in safe hands.
Right.
And after 6 weeks with him, they had the final copy. And still, I wasn't confident. And still, it came as a shock. And I sat back and watched, and my life literally changed overnight.
Right. We talk a lot about that first book, and how you have the gift of anonymity. Now, you were obviously a public figure, and a lot of people knew who you were. But in the literary circles, you weren't an established figure. Let's just put it that way.
Unknown.
Yeah, right. So then and there's something different that happens when no one knows you're writing a book. No one expects anything from you. And it's a unique gift that you have to live in that space. But then when you have a book like Cain and Abel that sells millions of copies, and all of a sudden, anytime anyone walks into a bookstore, there you are. Does that make the process more difficult afterwards? Because, one thing we say is at the beginning of a book, the blank page is kind of the great equalizer. Everyone starts at the same spot. No matter what your past success has been, everyone faces a blank page eventually. What's it like to follow up that sort of success?
I didn't think of it that way.
Good.
I followed it with the prodigal daughter, who was the daughter of Abel and had married the son of Cain and wanted to be the first woman president of the United States. And I thought that, with my love of politics, particularly British and American politics, I thought that was a good theme. So I didn't actually go through the process you're accepting. And I learned only the other day, Hank, from a dear friend of mine who's recently retired from publishing. He rang me up and said, how's the next book going? And it was next in line. It was my story about Princess Diana. And I said, very well, thank you. And indeed it is my 26th book. And he said, I have authors on the line. Pick up what you said, Hank. He said, I have authors on the line once a week who said, oh, hell, I haven't got an idea. I don't know where to go. And they've often had a touch of success. They've often had a feel of it and haven't been able to replicate it. And I can't complain about that. I've never had writer's block. I know the next 3 stories, and I'm 82 years old. So no, that frankly, Hank, hasn't been a problem. Yes, the other side of your question is correct. Are you aware there are millions of people out there who reach you and might well say, well, he's not up to the standard he used to be, is he? Well, he's falling off, isn't he? Yes, when I'm writing, I'm very conscious of that. And that may be the reason I still do 14 drafts of every book and do not hand it over to the publisher until I'm convinced it's the best I can do. Now, it may not be good enough for the reader, Hank, but I have to believe in my heart it's the best I can do.
You are famous for your 14 drafts of editing and re-editing your manuscripts, and I'm glad you brought that up. What is your editing process like? And you know, when you after you finish that first draft, do you set it aside for a period of time and kind of let it leave your immediate consciousness and then come back to it with fresh eyes?
First draft takes about 6 weeks.
Okay.
50 days. Takes about 300 hours. And yes, I hand it over to my personal assistant, Alison, and she types it up and hands it back, triple spaced. But the answer to your interesting question is I would say I take a month off.
Okay.
About a month. And then I go back to what I call draft 4, 5, and 6, having had a month off, having done other things, having gone to the theater, done one of my charity auctions, read a book, whatever it might be. I do a lot of things in between. Go and see a sporting match because I love my rugby and I love my cricket. So that month will be full of things to take my mind off the book. And then I will go back to my home in Mallorca, the writer's block, called Writer's Block. I go back to my home in Mallorca and sit down and do draft 4, 5, and 6 and hand it back to Alison. And we go through the whole process until we get to about draft 14. Now, when I'm only changing a couple of words on each page, maybe a line every dozen pages, maybe a paragraph every chapter, then I know I'm there and it's time for an editor to read it and a new set of eyes say, we need a little bit more of that, Jeffrey. We need a little bit of that, Jeffrey. I need that. And I'm lucky to have a first-class editor at HarperCollins whose great strength is to see how something could be added or taken away. And that is, funnily enough, exactly what I'm working on today.
So you still work strictly longhand?
I write every word with a felt tip pen. I can't type. I can't even turn on this machine we're talking to each other on, Hank. Alison is sitting 1 yard away from me in case you suddenly, stupidly disappear and lose me. Because if you do, I won't be able to get you back. So she's sitting here, and it has happened when people disappear, and she gets them back in a few seconds. But otherwise, I'd be lost. So answer, no, I'm not a modern man. I like to handwrite every word. I like to do it slowly and quietly in my own time. And if my wife, who's a scientist, she always has the latest technical equipment, and she buzzes away on it all day. But not me, not me.
You, the William Warwick series, we're up to book 5 now, and it seems to me that you have had an overarching plan for this character and his personal growth and his career all along. What is your planning process like?
Well, I decided I wanted to do something different because after the Clifton Chronicles, several people wrote to me, Hank, and said, your hero in the Clifton Chronicles, Harry Clifton, is an author, and it's obviously based on you. And Emma, his wife, is obviously based on Mary, my wife. And about that. But I thought, I want to write another detective story. Well, there's enough of those out there. That's when I came up with the idea that I would have a young man who came out of school. His father, a distinguished Queen's Counsellor, would want him to go to Oxford and read law and then join him in chambers, whereas this young man wanted to be a constable on the beat in London. So he takes no notice of his father. He goes to London University and reads art history. And then he goes as a copper on the beat in London. And his first real dealings with Scotland Yard is in the art fraud squad. So I wanted to do a different subject with each book, while he was a different rank each book. So in the first book, you'd have art fraud. In the second book, drugs. In the third book, police corruption. In the fourth book, and so on. And then we get to the murder. And in the book we are discussing, he's now reached superintendent, and he is dealing with royalty protection next in line. But I have to live to the age of 84, maybe 5, maybe 6, if he's going to get to be. I have no doubt he's capable of being the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. It's just whether I live long enough to get in there. So I'm still enjoying it. And the answer to your question is I tried to make my approach to this slightly different. So the reader would say, yeah, I'm now reading royalty protection. He's now a superintendent. Perhaps I'll go back and read what he did as a sergeant. Perhaps I'll wait to see what happens in the next book. But I'm now mentally in the middle of the next book. Know where it's going to be when he will be a chief superintendent. And he will be dealing with. No, I'm not going to tell you that.
Well, you're not allowed to pass on to the next life until.
Thank you.
Until you finish this, we're just gonna demand that right now.
Right.
Do you have any sort of formal written plan for a book, or do you hold it all in your head?
I hold most of it in my head and talk it through to myself a lot and jot down a few notes, perhaps. But no, because I'll tell you the problem with that is you write a chapter and it goes somewhere you hadn't planned.
Right.
You've got it all planned out and you're going way over there, and in fact going in exactly the opposite direction. It's too late. So you may have a rough plan in your mind, but I can tell you it never goes that way. The pen will take you where it wants to go, and you will wise to follow it. Because then if you don't know where you're going, Hank, how can the reader know where you're going?
Right. When is this book set?
2002. I think because I'm in the middle of the next one, which I know is 2005-06. I had to think back. Yes, royalty protection. Next in line is 2002.
Is there something about writing in the past that has certain benefits than writing a book set in the present with all of the technological trappings that we have? I mean, 2002 is not that far away, but things have changed in 20 years.
You've got to remember, I started these books in the 1990s.
Right.
And the Clifton Chronicles way back in the 1945 era. And what I've done is I've cheated, Hank. I've taken my life, because I was born in 1940. And you say, is there an advantage? Yeah, don't forget, I've gone through those decades. I've lived through those years. So I can write about them because I've been through them. So when we're at 2002, I can remember what was going on in my life. When I get to 2005, I can remember what's going on in my life. So the background material should be fairly authentic because I've been through it. For some people, I'm writing, you're quite right, although it's only 20 years ago, recent history. But it's part of my life. And that has made, frankly, that makes it easier because you remember things that happened, you check things, you go over things. and you try to tell the reader things that they might have missed or didn't even know about.
One of the hallmarks of your books is that they are chock full of very specific details about a wide variety of topics, from art history to finance to politics, kind of all over the place. Is there, how do you familiarize yourself with say you're going to write a book and it's going to be about the royal protection? How do you familiarize yourself with those intimate details that really make the story seem authentic?
Well, many of the things, of course, I've experienced myself, as I said, but you're quite right to raise that. I have a chief superintendent, John Sutherland, retired, and a detective sergeant, Michelle Roycroft, who was in the drug squad for 20 years, who's retired, and they check all the facts. If I say it was a desk sergeant who began to fill in the form, they say, no, it's a custody sergeant. If I say it's an order form, they say, no, it's a report form. So they don't allow me to make technical mistakes. And with each book, I say to them, get me the expert in this country on royalty protection. And they arrive a week later with Commander somebody who has been in charge of royalty protection for 30 years. I give him my book. I don't want him to write the story. That's what I do. And
Right.
again, he will go over. Now, for example, in the book you've just read, Next in Line, Hank, a lot of people have been saying, is the scene with Princess Diana when she's at Asprey's for a lunch and several people start stealing because of silver display. Asprey's have got a wonderful silver display on the table for Princess Diana. Several people have said to me, Jeffrey, is it true that they were stealing the forks and the pepper pots? And I said, yes. I got that from Ken Worf, who was her royalty protection officer. And I said, why didn't you do something about it, you worm? And he said, my job is to protect Princess Diana, not to be after people who steal pepper pots. And if I'd gone off to do something about stealing pepper pots and something had happened, Princess Diana, during that 10 minutes, it would have been me who was in major problem. So you see, when you say that, Hank, I'm listening to people who've been through it. I'm talking to people who've had that experience. And I've said, tell me an amazing happening. So I was able to write a whole scene in Asprey. I went over to Asprey, had a look at the silver, had a look at the room, had a look at the whole thing, and was able to write a whole scene on a couple of sentences he told me. But it was the fact that someone had started stealing silver pepper pots right there in front of her that I thought the public, my readers, will love that. And the proof is several have come back and said, is that true, Jeffrey? Is that true? Now, at the beginning of the book, as you know, Hank, it says, is this a true story? Truth is that about half is true and half isn't. But you, the reader, have to decide true and which bit I made up.
I love that. There's, as we mentioned earlier, this is a really interesting time in world events, and with the passing of the Queen, there's a lot of interest in America because we have this sort of shared history. What do you
mean sort of shared history? We have a shared history. You were a colony, and we took care of you until you threw us out. Is how I see it.
Touche. But you mentioned, the massive book deal that you had with Simon & Schuster and, with Cain and Abel, and you've had a very loyal following in America. Do you find that your American readers are, just as interested maybe even more interested in our shared history, and because America lacks a lot of the pomp and circumstance that is enjoyed by our British cousins. Do you find that across the pond there's a special interest?
Well, I think that's the lucky thing, Hank, because I write what I write and pray. And the truth is that the Americans are fascinated by our way of life, as I am fascinated by the American way of life. I've followed every presidential election and have many friends in the United States. So it's a two-way river, this one. And I've loved studying American politics. I mean, Jefferson, who is a big factor in the new book, has been a hero of mine forever. Franklin, I think, is one of the great people of all time. And so it is a two-way street. But yes, if I dare to say it without you jumping down the microphone and cutting me off and never speaking to me again, Hank, the one big thing that's come out, or many big things come out of the tragic death of Her Majesty, but one of the big things come out when it comes to ceremonial, when it comes to organizing and running a great state occasion. Frankly, I don't think anyone does it better than the British.
I have to agree with you there. I have to agree with you. And our television has been tuned to the news from Great Britain for the last several days, and will through the continuation of next week, I'm sure. And it's nice to see that that people can still be honored and can that a country can come together for a mutual display of
unity, really.
Unity. Yeah, that's a.
In fact, I was on television yesterday and said, I wish Her Majesty was alive so she could see how much the British people loved and admired her. I think she'd have been shocked. I was walking through Green Park yesterday on my way to Buckingham Palace, where the tents are there for interviewing people. And I was passed by hundreds of people carrying flowers. And the body has been moved from Buckingham Palace. The coffin has been moved from Buckingham Palace to the Palace of Westminster. And the crowds were just unbelievable. I am in a very privileged position as a member of the House of Lords. I will be going tomorrow with my wife, and I will be allowed to come in from the House of Lords end and pay my respects and leave. And I consider that will be one of the most telling moments in my life, because I've lived with three monarchs. I was born under King George. I had 70 years of Queen Elizabeth, and now my monarch is King Charles III. So I've had three monarchs. So to be able, the privilege as a member of the House of Lords, to be able to pay my respect tomorrow will be a very important day in my life.
I can only imagine, and our condolences to the entire country of Britain right now. Next in line.
The point you made, Hank, it's true. This isn't just England. I think the whole world seems to have admired her for the loyal service she gave to her country.
100%. 100%. Next in line, William Warwick, Book 5 is available now everywhere when you're hearing this. We'll put links to all the places where you can buy it in the show notes of this episode. If you want to hold the hardcover in your hand, or Kindle edition, or audiobook, it's available everywhere. Jeffrey, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
No, thank you, Hank, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it. And I always enjoy being interviewed by someone who actually has read the book and knows what they're talking about. So I'm very grateful. Thank you very much indeed.